Well, hello again. In this video, we are going to look at how to create and use stored procedures. This is a series of videos. So the first thing we're going to look at is stored procedure basics, followed by getting information about stored procedures, and next using stored procedures for transactions, and then for abstraction, and then with error handling, followed by return codes, and finally a quick look at creating a stored procedure template. So number of videos in this module. Let's go ahead and get started with the first part, which is stored procedure basics. So to start with that, I'm going to create a very, very simple database. It's got a single table called customers, and I'll put a table in, I'll insert some data, I'll create a view, and of course I'll make sure the view works, and yes, I can see the data, all is good. So we'll use that a little bit later in the videos. Right now, let's start off with something even more basic, and that's just the simple syntax of a stored procedure. So the syntax is create procedure, and then after that you put the as keyword. Optionally, you can put begin and end. I recommend you do so. This basically marks out the beginning and the ending of the stored procedure. And you can put go at the very end of this, but stored procedures can only contain a single batch of code, so you would never put go inside of it. That would end the stored procedure. So this is the very, very basic one. It just has a select statement that I can use to select data. To execute it, I execute the add value stored procedure by just calling it like this. Execute with the word spelled out, or just the first four letters is fine. Does the same thing. And of course, I can even go through and just execute it without the word execute at all. It runs the same. So now, let's change it around a little bit. The change will come in the form of adding some additional code. So you alter the stored procedure. Syntax is alter procedure as begin and end, and then you put in whatever new code you want. You'll notice that I don't have to type in the whole word procedure like I didn't have to type in the whole word execute. I can just go ahead and use the first four letters. Perfectly fine. And then I go through and I put a different statement, like I'm changing the values here. I'm also using a print statement. Now, with functions, we can do some basic calculation like this and select it. But we can't use the print statement, nor can we do that in a view. But here I can. And although that's a marginal change, it is a change nonetheless. I can indeed see data in the print statement. Or with the print statement, I should say. Now, like functions and stored procedures can indeed have input parameters. Views cannot, but stored procedures can. So I see I have a value 1 and value 2 parameter I made up. Again, I just made up the names. I set them as floating point values. And now, actually, I can do something a little bit more useful with my stored procedure. You pass in some values, and I'll perform a calculation. Now I execute it like this, in which case I tell it what the parameter is, and tell it what the argument is. I tell it what the parameter is, I tell it what the argument is. That works. That's actually the best way to go. You can actually do a truncated version of it, in which case you don't indicate the parameter name, you just pass in the arguments. But you can't execute the stored procedure with parentheses like you would a function. That does work in functions, but not in sprocs. Sprocs is a slang term for a stored procedure. You also hear procs, sprocs, you hear a bunch of things. But the one I typically use, when I was introduced to 20 some odd years ago, was sproc, so that's what you hear me say sometimes. Stored procedure parameters can actually have a default value. Like here I've gone through and set a default value of 0. What this means is that if you don't provide a value, it'll just use that, which is quite handy. So now if I do provide a value, so the argument of 5 is being passed in to the parameter value 1 and 3 into value 2, it works as expected. But if I don't provide any value at all, it still works, whereas previously it would have given me an error because I didn't provide any arguments. But here it does indeed work. It just uses my default. And if I specify a argument value for my parameter value 1, it'll just use the 0 for the default value of 0 for my second parameter, value 2. If I pass in something to value 2, it will just use the default for my first parameter, value 1, and so on. If you want to be more explicit, you can actually use the word default. That's probably a better choice. Otherwise, you're dealing with invisible code. But that's how it works. Next up, we'll take a look at how you get information about the stored procedures you create.